In 1840, Auckland did not begin as a finished city. It began as a fragile colonial settlement on newly organized ground, with temporary shelters, limited infrastructure, and a future that was still uncertain. Yet from the very beginning, the place was given a role far greater than its appearance suggested. Auckland was not treated as a random outpost. It was chosen, surveyed, and imagined as the center of a new political order. A key figure in this early stage was Felton Matthews, whose surveying and mapping helped turn the area from an undefined frontier into a place that could be measured, divided, and planned. This mattered deeply. Before a city can be built in timber, stone, or brick, it must first be organized in lines, boundaries, and intentions. Auckland's earliest history was therefore not only about settlement, but about design. It was a place being prepared for authority. That sense of purpose became even clearer when Governor Hobson declared Auckland the capital. This decision immediately transformed the meaning of the settlement. It was no longer simply somewhere people lived. It became the seat of government, the symbolic heart of colonial administration, and the location through which power would be expressed. In principle, Auckland was now the political center of the colony. Yet the physical reality remained strikingly modest. The first settlement was marked by tents and makeshift structures, not grand institutions. That contrast is one of the most revealing features of Auckland's beginnings. On one side stood the ambition of government and planning. On the other stood the rough conditions of frontier life. The city's identity was born in the tension between those two worlds. Authority and improvisation, vision and vulnerability. Even in these early years, Auckland showed signs of long-term thinking. Plans for public spaces and future educational areas suggest that it was not viewed merely as a temporary administrative camp. It was already being imagined as a structured urban settlement, one that would eventually require civic life, open land, and institutions beyond immediate survival. This is what makes Auckland's origins so important. Its early story is not just about first arrivals or temporary dwellings. It is about a settlement that was asked to become something larger almost immediately. Auckland was born both incomplete and ambitious. It was a place still covered in the rawness of first occupation, yet already carrying the weight of political expectation. That dual identity would define much of its later history. From the beginning, Auckland was not simply growing, it was being shaped for significance. Once Auckland had been established as the capital, the next challenge was far more difficult, turning a fragile settlement into a functioning city. Political status alone could not sustain an urban center. If Auckland was to become more than a symbolic capital, it needed order, institutions, commerce, and a visible built environment. In the years that followed, this transformation began in earnest. One of the most important steps in this process was the establishment of law and order. The presence of legal authority, prisons, and systems of punishment showed that Auckland was moving beyond the unstable conditions of first settlement. Power was no longer just announced from above, it was now being enforced in daily life. This shift mattered because a city cannot operate on political declarations alone. It needs structure, it needs rules, it needs institutions strong enough to shape behavior and sustain public authority. Auckland, during this stage, was developing that framework. At the same time, the city's physical form began to take shape through the expansion of commercial areas such as Commercial Bay and Queen Street. These spaces became more than simple roads or waterfront zones. They formed the backbone of Auckland's early urban life. Trade routes, movement, exchange, and business all began to gather there, giving the city a rhythm beyond government. This was a critical turning point. A capital that relies only on administration remains shallow. A city becomes durable when it also develops an economic pulse, and Auckland was beginning to find one. The construction of the first Parliament building in 1854 gave this growing city even greater political definition. It signaled that Auckland's role as capital was not merely theoretical. The machinery of government had physical presence. Institutions now had walls, rooms, and visible authority. This deepened the city's identity as a center of decision-making and colonial organization. Architecture also played an essential role in this period. The emergence of Gothic Revival style and the importance of St. Paul's Church reveal that Auckland was not only being built for practical use, it was also being shaped to reflect British cultural and spiritual values. Such buildings gave the city a symbolic language. They connected this distant settlement to a broader imperial world and projected a sense of continuity, legitimacy, and civilization. By the mid-1850s, Auckland had grown into something far more substantial than the rough encampment of 1,840. It now had law, streets, commerce, institutions, and recognizable urban character. Its streets carried movement. Its buildings expressed authority. Its architecture reflected both purpose and identity. Auckland was becoming a real city, one shaped by political ambition but increasingly sustained by urban structure. Still, beneath this progress remained a deeper uncertainty, whether its political importance would last. That question would soon define the next phase of its history. Auckland's history becomes especially compelling at the moment when its original advantage began to slip away. In its early years, the city grew under the protection of political status. It had been chosen as the capital and developed accordingly. But history rarely allows one form of power to remain secure forever. By the late 1850s and into the 1860s, Auckland was expanding in population and commerce. Yet it was also moving toward a decisive turning point that would reshape its future. By 1857, Auckland's population had reached around 8,000. In the context of a young colonial settlement, this was a significant figure. It meant that Auckland had become more than an administrative base. It was now a place attracting people, investment, and practical opportunity. Growth in timber trade and land transactions strengthened this expansion. These activities reflected the broader colonial economy. Natural resources were being extracted, land was being reorganized into economic value, and Auckland was increasingly integrated into that process. In other words, the city was beginning to stand on an economic foundation of its own. Its port connections also mattered greatly. Auckland's links with Sydney and London tied it into larger maritime networks, giving it a strategic importance that extended well beyond local administration. A city with direct access to major trade routes possesses a different kind of power. It becomes a place where goods, people, and information move through a much wider imperial system. This would prove crucial once Auckland's political role changed. That change came in 1865, when Auckland lost its status as capital to Wellington. On the surface, this looked like a severe blow. A city built around government had lost the central institution that justified its early prominence. In many cases, such a shift might have led to decline, stagnation, or a gradual loss of relevance. But Auckland did not follow that path. Instead, the loss of capital status forced the city to redefine itself. It could no longer depend on political privilege. It now had to build significance through trade, geography, and economic energy. This was a profound transition. Auckland moved away from being known primarily as the center of colonial power and began developing into a city whose strength rested on commerce and maritime connection. This moment reveals one of the deepest truths about Auckland's historical character. It grew strongest, not by preserving its first role, but by adapting after losing it. Political authority had given the city its beginning, but it did not guarantee its future. The real test came when that authority shifted elsewhere. Auckland survived because it already possessed another foundation: a port, a growing economy, and an ability to absorb change. So the loss of capital status was not simply an ending. It was also a release from dependence on a single identity. Auckland's path forward would now be harder, but it would also be broader. It was no longer just a displaced capital. It was becoming something potentially more durable, a city defined by movement, trade, and practical importance. This story contains fictionalized elements for entertainment and educational purposes. After losing its capital status, Auckland entered a new stage of development that proved more decisive than its political beginning. No longer the seat of government, it had to establish its importance through economic strength. The late 19th century became the period in which Auckland successfully reinvented itself, drawing power not from formal authority but from trade, technology, and maritime infrastructure. One of the most transformative developments of this period was the rise of refrigerated shipping. This technological change had major consequences for New Zealand as a whole, and Auckland was positioned to benefit directly from it. Before refrigeration, distance imposed serious limits on agricultural exports, especially perishable goods such as meat and dairy. Once refrigerated transport became viable, those limits weakened dramatically. Products could now travel much farther without losing value, opening a path between New Zealand's producers and distant overseas markets. Auckland's role in this system was crucial because it was already an important port. The city became part of the chain that helped turn New Zealand into what was often described as the farm of Britain. This phrase captures the economic shift of the period. New Zealand was becoming deeply tied to British demand, and Auckland stood as one of the major gateways through which this connection operated. As a result, the city's significance expanded beyond its regional setting. It was now linked to imperial commerce on a larger scale. Infrastructure reinforced this role. The opening of the Calliope dock in 1888 symbolized Auckland's growing maturity as a maritime centre. A major port city cannot rely only on the arrival and departure of ships. It also needs the capacity to maintain, repair, and support them. The dock therefore represented more than a single engineering achievement. It reflected Auckland's deeper shift into a city built around sustained maritime function. It was becoming a place that not only handled trade, but also supported the larger machinery of seaborne movement. Population growth mirrored these changes. By 1884, Auckland's population had reached around 40,000. That increase reveals the scale of the city's economic momentum. People do not gather in such numbers without opportunity. Work, trade, services, and supporting industries were all helping to reshape Auckland into a larger and more complex urban centre. What makes this period so important is that Auckland's new strength came from adaptation rather than inheritance. It no longer held the political prestige of a capital, yet it found a different route to importance. Its port, shipping links, and integration into export networks allowed it to become central in another sense, not as the command center of the colony, but as one of its most vital economic engines. By the end of the 19th century, Auckland had done more than recover from political loss. It had discovered a more practical and enduring basis for urban growth. The city was no longer simply living in the shadow of the capital it once was. It had become a commercial and maritime center with its own momentum, and that transformation would shape everything that followed. The growth of Auckland in the late 19th century did not protect it from the wider shocks of the modern world. Like many port cities tied to imperial systems, Auckland was drawn into a period of conflict, instability, and rapid change between 1899 and 1919. These years tested not only the city's economy and institutions, but also its resilience as a community shaped by forces far beyond its own boundaries. The South African War in 1899 was one sign of Auckland's place within the imperial network. The city was not simply a commercial harbour at the edge of the world. It was connected to the military and political movements of the British Empire. Participation in imperial conflict demonstrated that Auckland's role extended beyond trade. It was also part of a larger structure of allegiance, logistics, and strategic significance. This reality was reinforced by the presence of the Royal Navy in its port, which highlighted Auckland's maritime importance in both economic and military terms. Ports often reveal the dual character of empire. They are places of business, but also places of control. In Auckland's case, the harbour linked the city to global exchange, while also exposing it to the tensions of war and power. This gave the city a larger presence, but it also meant that distant events could shape local life in direct and immediate ways. The First World War deepened this reality, bringing broader social strain and loss. Then, in 1918, the influenza pandemic added a different kind of devastation. Disease affected urban life, not through politics or military movement, but through the vulnerability of the population itself. It disrupted ordinary routines, strained communities, and exposed the fragile human side of a city, often described through its infrastructure or economic role. This period reminds us that Auckland's history is not only about growth, trade, and expansion. It is also about endurance under pressure. Yet, even amid war and pandemic, Auckland continued to modernize. The early appearance of electric trams and motor vehicles points to a city that was still changing its internal rhythms. Movement within the city was becoming faster, more organized, and increasingly shaped by new technologies. This coexistence of crisis and modernization is one of the defining paradoxes of the early 20th century. Societies could experience trauma while still advancing in transport, planning, and urban form. For Auckland, these years acted as a severe test. They showed that the city's rise had not made it immune to global instability, but they also showed that Auckland could absorb pressure without losing direction. It remained a working port, an urban centre, and a city still moving toward modernity even in difficult circumstances. This stage of Auckland's history matters because it reveals strength in a different form. Earlier decades had demonstrated adaptation after political loss. These years demonstrated endurance during disruption. Auckland was not simply expanding because conditions were favourable. It was learning how to continue through conflict, grief, and uncertainty. That ability to endure would become an essential part of its later success. This story contains fictionalized elements for entertainment and educational purposes. By the mid-20th century, Auckland had already passed through several identities: frontier settlement, colonial capital, commercial port, and tested urban centre. But from 1959 onward, the city entered another decisive phase, one driven by infrastructure, suburban expansion, and a new scale of urban growth. The key symbol of this transformation was the Auckland Harbour Bridge. When the bridge opened in 1959, it did far more than improve transport. It changed the structure of the city itself. By connecting North Shore with the central city, it reduced the barrier once imposed by geography and allowed Auckland to expand more freely across the harbour. This mattered because natural landscapes had long shaped the limits of movement and settlement. With the bridge in place, distance was reconfigured. Areas that had once felt separated became integrated into a broader urban system. This new connectivity encouraged suburban growth and accelerated urbanization. Auckland was no longer developing mainly through its historic core or waterfront functions. It was becoming a wider metropolitan area, spreading outward and absorbing new residential zones, new patterns of commuting, and new relationships between centre and periphery. The city's growth became less concentrated and more expansive, a sign of modern urban transformation. In time, Auckland became the largest city in New Zealand. That fact carries special historical meaning. It had lost its capital status almost a century earlier, yet it ultimately emerged as the country's dominant urban centre in demographic and economic terms. This confirms one of the central patterns of Auckland's history. Its greatest strength did not come from holding on to its first role, but from repeatedly adapting to changing circumstances. It was not the permanent capital. It became something else, something larger in practical influence. Yet Auckland's modern identity cannot be explained by infrastructure and scale alone. Its cultural and social dimensions remained essential. Events such as the regatta preserved the city's maritime memory. The interaction between Maori and Pākehā traditions shaped its social texture. Land conflicts associated with the New Zealand Wars remind us that Auckland's growth was connected to deeper tensions over ownership, power, and historical justice. Meanwhile, the conversion of former government buildings into university spaces illustrates another recurring pattern in the city's story: old roles giving way to new ones. That pattern may be the best way to understand Auckland as a whole. It is a city that has changed function without losing momentum. It began as a rough settlement, became a capital, then a port-driven commercial centre, and finally a modern metropolis defined by mobility, expansion, and national importance. Its history is not a straight line of uninterrupted power. It is a history of redefinition. That is what gives Auckland its distinctive place in New Zealand's past. It did not become the country's leading city by remaining what it once was. It became so by learning, again and again, how to become something new.